Well, welcome to today's episode, a curious conversation with Kate Canales, who's the department chair and a distinguished senior lecturer at the Department of Design at University of Texas, Austin. Kate, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
So when I started doing some research, because we kind of connected with you through Tanya White, and I saw that your whole career really has had this emphasis on human-centric design. And I got really excited because obviously that's a core principle for the Square, is a focus on conversations that have to do with human-centered design. I've also heard the term design thinking. Can you kind of distinguish between the two for me?
Sure. So you know how this is perfect because you're the square. You know how all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares.
Okay.
So I'm gonna draw it out that way. Human-centered design is a set of methodologies that allow you to think through a challenge like a designer. And so in that way, you are design thinking. So human-centered design is a type of design thinking, but not all design thinking is human-centered design. So
wait a minute. In this case, then, human-centered design is the rectangle and design thinking is the square.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
You've got it. And so design thinking is kind of a if you'll indulge me in a little nerd out, Design thinking originates from educational psychology in the 60s, and describes this kind of innate human capacity for a way of approaching the world. So in the same way that we can all express ourselves artistically and we can all do quantitative analysis, all people design. It's just a thing that all people do all the time. And then some of us get really, really skilled in certain types of design. So what has happened more recently with design thinking in this kind of trendier version of things lately is that an industry has emerged around helping people remember how to do that innate human thing that we all do well. And they've brought a methodology to it. And by and large, that methodology has been human-centered design, which is why the two terms kind of get intermingled and sometimes even used interchangeably.
Got it. Correctly or incorrectly.
Hey, you know what? I don't think it matters that. It doesn't matter too much. Yeah.
All right. Well, then I need to know, just let's take half a step back. How did you get into this field? Like, why design for you?
It wasn't an obvious thing. My designer origin story is not like some that you hear where kids are inventing things in the garage and working on their parents' woodworking equipment and that kind of thing. I sort of accidentally discovered mechanical engineering and that became my college major, but I didn't set out to do that. Although looking back, a lot of the hints were there in hindsight. I was really into Legos and things like that as a kid. So I majored in mechanical engineering. I also studied art, studio art. And by the time I was a junior in college, I knew I did not want to do both of those things, or I did not want to do either of those things. I wanted to do both of them.
So with a year left to graduate, you realized what you'd been working on for the last 3 years you didn't want to do.
Basically, I still stand by the decision to major in it because I think it was a great fundamental thing. But I mean, my Mega Millions jackpot winning lottery ticket was that I got an internship at Ideo after my junior year in college. And really, that's where I came of age professionally. I think of Ideo as where I'm from as a designer, sort of culturally and philosophically, and in terms of just an unwavering expectation for exciting, fun work. They set the bar.
If you have to think back to like the first, after college, the first kind of product you designed, would that be at Ideo?
Yeah. Yep. I went from an internship straight into full-time there. Yeah.
What was it?
Well, one of the early ones, which is one of my favorites, is the Jumperoo, manufactured by Fisher-Price. If you you may be familiar with this monstrosity, you may have even let it take over your living room for a period of time. But that was an invention from one of my very first projects, obviously on a team at Ideo, looking at. Before that, the product was a thing that used to hang in the door jamb.
Right, it would like completely screw up the molding around your door. Yeah.
And it was terrifying for parents because although it was a pretty secure mechanism, it looked like it was going to come crashing down on your precious baby's head all the time. So we invented the sort of bungee type of mechanism in that. My name's on the patent for that product. My vanity insists that I point out that we did not work on the industrial design for that product.
I think we had for my youngest. I think we had the one that was a riff on that design that was the jungle theme. So it had like the things you could play with as you were jumping, but it completely took over the living room, just as you said.
It's just it's a lot. It's a whole lot, but really such a great design project to work on right out of the gate, and to have something that's been that long lasting in the market is really unusual. It's also the only project I've ever done as a designer, I think, that I also became a legitimate consumer of later as a parent. Mm-hmm. So, I bought one and put it in the middle of my living room. So I don't think I've done that with anything else.
You had a lot of firsthand knowledge of how well it worked at that point.
Yeah, right.
So was there something about that you found fascinating in terms of, is it because it was something that was publicly and very widely available? Is something about rethinking an existing product? What was it that you found fascinating about it?
Both of those things are appealing to most designers. To have something that's commercially successful is always fun. But I think the thing that kind of hooked me in on that project was the idea of that insight that I described, the sort of parents were afraid that thing was going to come crashing down, even though mechanically it really wasn't going to come crashing down. I got really, really into looking at some of the psychological and emotional and social factors of a product as a way of redesigning that product. And I was at just the right place to get fascinated by that, and found some important mentors who helped me develop that as a way of designing, as a point of view. And I think that gets to your earlier question about human-centered design as a frame, especially in product design. That's where that started.
Well, and I love that even takes it beyond you can claim a human-centered design in terms of we're putting humans in the center of this design that you created, quite literally. But it gets beyond the idea of it's something for humans to something thinking about how people think about the design and think about the product or products that are in the similar that have come before. How have you? I mean, you've worked in a lot of different commercial companies, and in addition to being in the education sector, how does that carry across the multiple industries you've worked in?
Well, most of the work I went on to do, and that I think I enjoy more now, is outside of the physical product space and into more systems, complex systems where humans exhibit behavior and express emotion in those systems. And I'm gonna describe that very broadly as the design of experiences. And whether you're making a jumperoo or a theme park, that is what you're doing. You're designing a human experience. So I think it's almost limitless, the places where you can use that lens. And it's not always the most important lens for decision making, but almost everything that is designed is an experience of some kind.
You mentioned that you kind of think of Ideo as your home, and certainly they're extremely well known for being creative and thoughtful. I am curious. It seems like the perfect place to kind of grow out of, and for what you're doing now. Are there any other projects that you worked on while you were there that, I know their slogan is positive impact through design, that you feel had a real positive impact through design?
Yes, sure. There's some things that I did early in my career, especially designing toys, that you could probably describe as destined to become landfill. But mostly, some of the work that I did at Ideo in the later years, I was there for about 8 years. And in the later years, I started doing a lot of work in the healthcare sector. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that's become a big theme in my work now. So I was very specifically influenced by some of those projects. And the healthcare is such a great example of a system that is complex and innately human, and in desperate need of experience design and other design in this country. So I would point toward that suite of projects in that phase of my time there as being really influential and still impacting the work I do now. We have a new master's degree at UT in the Department of Design that just launched this year, which is a 1-year accelerated master's in design with a concentration in design and health. And we're in partnership with the medical school in that degree. It's a really, really innovative degree, and a really incredible set of students who are going to go and apply design in the health sector.
Okay, so I want to jump in a little bit to the education side, but before I do, out of that kind of the family of products, specifically the healthcare ones, is there one that kind of stands out in your mind?
Well, we did, by the time I got to that stage, I really wasn't making stuff anymore. Somebody, probably David Kelly, called it things that make a noise when you drop them, which is where I started. I started by designing things that make a noise when you drop them. By the time I was in the healthcare space, I was really designing processes and other systems. The one that really sticks with me, well, there are so many good stories, but I worked with an amazing team at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, redesigning with the goal to reduce waiting times for outpatient chemotherapy patients. And this was 15 years ago. And they have become famous for having short wait times for outpatient chemotherapy in their Midtown facility. But we did such heartening and creative work around prototyping systems within the system without disrupting the system and without impacting any clinical outcomes. So it becomes this really sort of threading this needle to be creative in a very, very specific set of constraints. So that's one that sticks out.
So tell me a little bit about this movement. As a designer, you move from creating, as you said, something that makes a noise when it's dropped. It's a physical object. Like, you can point to it and you can say, there's the result of the months or even sometimes years of design that I put in, to doing a process which arguably can have a bigger impact in someone's life. What's that like as a designer? This
isn't the answer that probably seems obvious. Of course, it feels great. It feels great to have a patient spend less time waiting for chemotherapy as an outcome of your design.
Sure.
That's a fantastic thing. But I think that the truth is that as a designer, I almost don't care. I'm agnostic about the problem or the space where the problem sits, as long as it is kind of gnarly and experiential. I'm sure the firms I worked at, I know, turned down certain work for ethical reasons, things like that. So I've never really faced a ton of that stuff. And I do feel better about some of the work I've done versus others in terms of impact. But honestly, what gets me excited is the design work itself.
All right. So last question. I am curious about, your time with Ideo and with your time with Frog Design, and I'm curious. Obviously, you're on teams. How do you build consensus? How do you, when you've got especially designers who kind of all have an opinion about how something should get done, how do you come out the other end, still at least liking somewhat each other, and with a product that, you're really proud of?
Mm-hmm. The question of collaboration on teams is so hard it's like when you look directly at a star in the night sky and it disappears. It's so hard to articulate what makes a team work or click or like each other at the end of a project. But I think that part of what makes teams work in design is deadlines.
Okay.
And having that I like to lean into sort of a structure of deadlines and processes. And I think I've been on very few teams where the creative director says, no, I'm just going to decide. Because also when you are designing experiences and you have centered the human who you're either designing for or ideally with, and treating their experience as a form of expertise, if you really do understand that experience well, then that's where the answer lies. It's not in any one person's opinion.
I love the idea of treating, especially for people who may not classically be considered designers, treating their expertise or treating their experience as an expertise. That's a great way to think about it.
I've been working just the tiniest bit with a designer in Chicago named Chris Rudd, and he has a very, very strong point of view about that idea of expertise and centering that experience as a form of expertise. And in fact, he doesn't take on projects that aren't co-design projects. A lot of his work is in the social justice space and anti-racism, and he won't design for anyone, only with those who are impacted by the challenge at hand. And I think that's a really, really important critique as design moves from kind of this technical expertise, where I started out with an expertise around things like manufacturability. But when you apply design, as is happening with the movement around design thinking, to more systemic human systems, especially social systems, designing for people in that system is arrogant. So I think there is something really important to that. It's probably less important when you're designing, a clickable Sharpie marker, but definitely comes into play in a major way in these big social systems.
That was a great answer. Okay, so let's jump into the space that you're in now with education. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing. I
sometimes describe the role that I have right now and the work that we're doing in the Department of Design at UT Austin as a once-in-a-generation opportunity. People who work with me have heard me use that phrase so many times. For higher education, what we're doing right now is so exciting and unusual. And what's happened is a very well-established but small and kind of undernourished department of graphic design, which had been for 30 years inside art and art history at UT, was pulled out and kind of re-anointed as the School of Design and Creative Technologies, along with one other department that's in arts and entertainment technologies. So the dean and leadership at UT understood that design was having a renaissance and they needed to invest in design as an educational experience. So the requirements of my job as a department chair and as a professor include evolving and changing and growing and thinking about how to respond to what's happening in industry. And that just doesn't happen very often inside higher education. So that's what I'm doing right now. And I believe we have this really, really important opportunity, if not obligation, around diversifying the field of design, and to be able to do that in the position of a big public institution where most of the students are identify as demographic minorities is really exciting. So we think about two things. I try to get out of bed every day thinking about two questions and letting those influence all of our decisions. One is, who is a designer? And the other is, what is the work of a designer? And our job is to interpret the answer to that in as inclusive a way as possible in everything we do. So we've overhauled how we do admissions. We've overhauled our hiring. We're looking very critically at how to evolve our curriculum. And I just don't know where else that's happening in design education right now. So it's kind of a thrill.
It's obviously something you're passionate about. In the past, there's been this stigma about teaching, an incorrect one. I'll give you, but the stigma that if you can't do, you teach. Well, with somebody of your history and your expertise, it's very obvious that you can do. So why teach?
Well, I'll put my nasty comments about that turn of phrase for another curious conversation.
Oh, you can say them. I'll take it.
From Margarita. But I don't feel like I'm not doing. I actually think that what I'm doing right now is one of the most sophisticated design challenges imaginable. And I think that's true of all teaching. I think teaching is fundamentally an act of design. You are creating a learning experience for people in your field. And of course, at kind of a meta level, that field in this case also happens to be design. But I think I am designing every day now. So I don't know if other people in other fields feel that way about teaching. And maybe if you're maybe there's, well, I don't know. I'm not gonna pretend to know somebody else's experience, but I actually do still think of myself as a designer. I will admit that I miss having a brief. I miss having this, I miss the traditional studio. I do miss doing in that traditional way, but I also feel like I've never had a better design project than the one I'm doing now.
I love that. The last year and a half has even thrown what would be a normally challenging task into just a whole nother level. How has, the last year really of the pandemic changed, not just maybe both the way you teach practically, but also maybe the way you teach design, thinking in terms of a post-COVID world?
Yeah. I wish I could say something kind of glib like, oh, no, it hasn't changed a thing. But it's actually changed everything. You're right. It's fundamentally changed everything. And I think it's taken a really big toll on anybody who teaches anything, regardless of content. Our programs at UT include teaching design thinking and human-centered design, but we also teach the more, we have a real reverence actually for maybe the more traditional craft-based design fields like graphic design and industrial design. And I would say across the board, we've tried to approach it as a design problem. It's taken a lot of creativity. There's some great stories about a colleague who was teaching a class called Furniture Experiments in the spring of 2020. No, when did this start? Anyway.
Yeah, that would have been spring of 2020. Yeah.
That's right. Spring of 2020, and we went almost exactly halfway through the semester. It was like, you will be teaching furniture experiments online. And what those students and that instructor pulled off online was so impressive and beautiful, and they came up with new ways of documenting, and they had to use household materials and experiment with scale. And I think that I think in some ways it's been lovely and beautiful, and there are silver linings in a lot of the places. I think students' material budgets have plummeted because they're using cut up Amazon boxes at their mom's house, as their fundamental materials. But I also think I think we have yet to see what toll it's taken particularly on faculty burnout. I'm very worried about how hard it's been to pull it off. And I think students have suffered in a number of ways as well. We have taken advantage, though, of the fact that everything's now, anybody can be anywhere, anytime. And we've brought in some really prestigious, exciting, and diverse voices as teachers, as adjunct teachers, and as designers in residence with our students, because they don't actually need to be in residence. It's really broken some assumptions about how those systems work and who gets to be involved with a traditional higher ed program. So I'm grateful for those things.
And whether or not you have to physically be there or you can be virtually there.
That's right. We have a woman named Cheryl Miller, who's just a truly famous graphic designer who lives in New York City. She's been writing for 30 or 40 years about the status of Black designers in her field. And she did a residency with us in the fall and is now teaching in our program from her living room in New York City. And that, that is an incredible opportunity for our students that we wouldn't have even thought to do that before this.
One of the things that when we're talking about design that has increasingly been coming up, and there is something we had a conversation with Sam Flores a while back, who's the director of Hugo, and they were talking about the Curiosity Report, and the big thing that they have been thinking through this year is bias. What are some of those biases that you think, you mentioned that the idea of design thinking is going on 50 years old now. What are some of those biases that you think maybe are still unintentional biases or biases that we're not aware of?
I think I have to go back to that notion that we were talking about of the lived experience as expertise. And I think any design that isn't at some level co-created with the people who know that lived experience is biased. So I think that's where it occurs to me that design for 100 years in America has been dominated by white men, and we have to change that in order for the solutions to be more relevant in any sector and at any level of sophistication. So, I think there are a number of places where that plays out that are well documented beyond my expertise. But that's what that makes me think of, is that, and that is also a big part of our mission at the public institution, is educating and positioning professional designers who've been formally trained in design, as we are doing, which is only one way of coming into your life as a designer. But those students should be the most diverse as we can possibly admit to our program, so that they go in and bring that lived experience as well as their design expertise and their design training into the systems that they feel passionate about. And I don't know that there's been a generation of designers who are being formally trained in higher education who has had that opportunity quite to the extent that this generation does. So because design is kind of having this renaissance and is being recognized as a strategic capability, in so many sectors, I think these students will have an opportunity to bring that at a completely different level than we've ever had before.
I'm curious, you were talking about kind of the domination of white male designers. We just finished passing March, which was Professional Women's History Month. Do you see a difference in how designers are treated, specifically women designers are treated, not just over the course of your career, but even in the different sectors? So in the the public sector versus the education sector.
That's such an interesting question. I don't know if I've seen enough of a pattern that would be specific to design or designers, but women are treated differently in every sector.
Sure, of course.
I think there's some things that I bumped up against in my personal experience that have to do with systems level decision making around things like, I don't know, like maybe we should have a policy about maternity leave at the state and federal level that would change the opportunity for young women who want to also become parents. I mean, there are a lot of things that come to mind, but they're all at the policy level, and I'm not sure they're specific to our field. It's a good question. I'm also curious about that.
So I can't help but notice, especially with somebody like you with a design mind, and that is the world you live in, you have to be very intentional about what's behind you when you have a webcam. So I can, I understand the piano and the bedside table. The artwork is amazing. Tell me a little bit about the artwork.
Thank you. This is a evolving collection of self-portraits by my kids. They used to do one every single year. My son is not as interested in anymore. He's 12. But my daughter still makes one every year, and I have it professionally framed and put in this little corner of the house. So I just think they're about as beautiful as a piece of artwork can be. Don't you think? Can you see it?
I do. A little bit tongue in cheek, but I noticed the first time I noticed it was actually on your Facebook profile. But I love that. I mean, in all seriousness, especially having kids, I love that. It's a living artwork. It's something that as years go on and how you change in their eyes and how they develop different skills. I love that as an art project. That's why one of the reasons why I wanted to point it out.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very proud of that particular wall. And now that we're doing, this is my spot. This is where I teach. This is where I do meetings. This is where I do interviews. So now everybody's in on it. It used to be kind of a private corner of the house, but now everybody knows about it.
So as we start to wrap up, and again, we talked about, as you mentioned, this idea of design thinking is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. Human-centric design, is a newer, maybe buzz term for something that has already been thought about for a long time. But what do you think, the next 10, 15, 50 years holds in terms of how we design for humans?
The place where my mind goes immediately is to artificial intelligence. And this is not something that I know a lot about technically. I want to kind of caveat that at the beginning, but I think we're going to have some really powerful moments of revelation about maybe where our limits are or where we want our limits to be with some of that, and what is the role of design in every sense, including human-centered design, in that experience. And as those systems become more and more sophisticated and more human, what does that mean to design in a place where a machine is standing in as a human? I think that's going to be a fascinating place to watch for the next 10 to 50 years. And I think I hope that some of the the values of human-centered design come to play in for the people who are creating those systems. I can't say that we've been particularly good about watching out for those things so far, but I think there's a real opportunity for sort of a ethically engaged designer to participate in the design of those systems in a way that could probably change a lot of outcomes in the long run. So that's a place I'm curious to keep an eye on.
That's fascinating. I can't wait to see. Well, Kate, thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. It's been really, really exciting. And thank you for listening or watching. If you are watching the video podcast, you're getting just a portion of our full conversation. So make sure to check out down below in the description for the audio podcast for the entire conversation with Kate. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope that you join us again next week.
Thank you.